Even before his name learned how to echo, he stood within a palace filled with maps and weapons, feeling strangely small among legends promised to him, because greatness was spoken as destiny while belonging remained uncertain and unearned. He was praised loudly and questioned quietly, which created an early tension between expectation and self-understanding, since admiration pressed him forward while his private thoughts lagged behind, uncertain whether the future admired him or simply required him. Stories of heroes surrounded his childhood like thick tapestries, yet their perfection unsettled him, because comparison sharpened awareness of flaw, and flaw invited reflection long before triumph entered imagination as something reachable. His tutors spoke of virtue, reason, and control, while courtiers whispered about power and succession, and this double language taught him to listen between words, sensing truth often traveled quietly rather than proudly announced. He watched his father command rooms effortlessly, and although admiration lived there, so did distance, because strength displayed publicly left little room for tenderness that a thoughtful child quietly noticed and remembered. Crowds responded to him before he understood why, and that attention felt heavy rather than sweet, since visibility arrived early while self-definition followed slowly behind, struggling to keep pace with growing expectation. Books became companions during restless hours, offering alternative worlds that asked questions rather than demanded answers, and within those pages he explored courage and doubt side by side without needing applause. When ceremonies unfolded around him, shimmering with tradition, he noticed himself watching others watching him, an awareness that layered his thoughts and pulled him slightly outside moments meant to feel natural. He learned early that silence could protect curiosity, because speaking too quickly turned wonder into certainty, and certainty felt limiting to a mind already searching beyond the edges drawn for it. His mother's voice carried intensity and myth, weaving destiny into daily speech, and while those stories inspired fire, they also complicated rest, because every quiet moment seemed measured against prophecy. Between praise and prophecy, he sensed pressure accumulating, not as fear exactly, but as constant alertness, a readiness that denied ease and replaced playfulness with focus long before adulthood arrived. He trained his body dutifully, yet his mind often wandered toward questions of meaning, wondering whether conquest described land alone or the invisible spaces people carried within themselves. During lessons, he challenged ideas respectfully, prompting surprise and sometimes discomfort, because curiosity disrupted comfort, and comfort was valued by those who preferred smooth certainty over thoughtful pause. Peers admired him but rarely knew him, and this half-distance created loneliness disguised as leadership, since recognition without understanding seldom satisfies the quieter parts of a person. He noticed how loyalty formed not only through command but through listening, and he practiced observing reactions carefully, learning moods as one might learn weather signs before long journeys. Victory stories thrilled him briefly, yet faded quickly because repetition dulled excitement and left deeper questions unanswered about purpose, endurance, and what remained after banners lowered. He imagined lands far beyond familiar hills, not merely as prizes but as spaces where difference existed naturally, and that thought stirred longing rather than greed within his developing imagination. Even celebrations tired him, since performance demanded energy. He preferred to spend reflecting, and laughter around him sometimes amplified solitude rather than erased it during long evenings of courtly noise. He wrote thoughts privately, shaping words slowly, because writing allowed contradictions to coexist without being resolved immediately, which felt honest and therefore comforting. As responsibilities crept nearer, he sensed childhood receding without ceremony, replaced by preparation that assumed readiness rather than asked consent, a transition he noticed even if others did not. Moments of impatience surfaced, especially when restrained by protocol, yet restraint also strengthened internal discipline, teaching him timing mattered as much as intention. He admired boldness yet distrusted recklessness, balancing admiration with caution, because unchecked momentum frightened him more than stillness ever could. Power hovered like an approaching storm, visible yet distant, and he studied its shape carefully, knowing storms could nourish land or flatten it depending on how one entered them. He listened to debates attentively, tracking logic and emotion together, realizing persuasion relied on both, and that understanding people mattered as much as understanding arguments. When praised excessively, he felt discomfort rather than pride, sensing how easy it was for identity to become distorted by expectation, and he resisted being simplified. He questioned what it meant to lead wisely, since obedience seemed fragile without shared purpose, and he quietly sought examples beyond the obvious victories praised around him. Travel stories fascinated him because movement promised perspective, and perspective promised freedom from narrow certainty imposed by birthplace and role. He sensed ambition forming, though not as hunger alone, but as restlessness, a need to test boundaries rather than simply inherit them. Quiet moments offered relief, especially when he could observe unnoticed, reminding him that leadership need not always announce itself loudly to be effective. He noticed injustice as keenly as opportunity, and that awareness complicated ambition, forcing him to consider consequence alongside desire. Teachers emphasized greatness through legacy, yet he wondered privately whether inner balance mattered more than monuments remembered by strangers. His curiosity deepened, weaving together philosophy, strategy, and human behavior, creating an inner landscape as expansive as any territory yet named. Though confidence grew steadily, humility lingered, not as weakness, but as awareness that understanding remained incomplete and evolving. He studied examples of fallen leaders, recognizing pride's fragility, and resolved quietly to guard against believing applause defined truth. Moments of fear appeared unexpectedly, usually when imagining irreversible choice, yet fear sharpened focus rather than paralyzed movement. He grew sensitive to language, noticing how words inspired or confined, and he practiced choosing them carefully, even in thought. Social gatherings became laboratories of observation, where gestures revealed motives more clearly than speeches ever could. As you thinned into readiness, he sensed future decisions gathering weight, compressing time and narrowing tolerance for indecision. Still, patience remained his ally because rushing felt like borrowing confidence rather than earning it through reflection and preparation. He noticed how expectation shaped behavior, and he resisted becoming merely its echo, striving instead for authorship of intent. Quiet pride emerged, rooted not in certainty but in preparation, and that steadiness anchored him when admiration fluctuated unpredictably. He envisioned leadership as dialogue rather than command alone, a concept that shaped how he listened and responded even as authority approached. Memory became a resource, storing lessons drawn from observation rather than instruction, and he trusted those lessons increasingly. He accepted contradiction within himself, allowing strength and doubt to coexist without immediate resolution. As thresholds neared, his inner world felt settled yet alert, prepared without being rigid, open without being naive. He understood that movement would soon replace observation, yet resisted premature declaration, valuing readiness over display. The future loomed expansive and undefined, and rather than fear its size, he welcomed its uncertainty as space where intention could finally test itself. When movement finally replaced waiting, his thoughts did not quiet but sharpened, because action clarified questions rather than erased them, and each decision carried echoes of earlier doubts that now demanded courage shaped by reflection. He stepped forward with composure learned from long observation, yet inwardly he felt the strain of turning inward visions outward, knowing that imagined path must now survive contact with reality and resistant circumstance. Authority settled on his shoulders unevenly, sometimes fitting with ease and sometimes chafing, which reminded him that leadership was not a crown worn comfortably, but a weight adjusted daily through judgment. As voices around him grew louder, he practiced listening more carefully, distinguishing confidence from noise, because experience taught him that volume often disguised uncertainty rather than strength. He measured speed against patience, resisting reckless momentum, and this tension shaped his rhythm, producing advances that felt deliberate even when urgency pressed from every side. Trust became currency he handled cautiously, since loyalty revealed itself slowly, and he learned to watch patterns rather than promises when deciding whom to lean upon. Moments of solitude grew rarer yet more precious, serving as anchors where he recalibrated intention and reminded himself why motion mattered beyond triumph alone. He noticed how belief moved people faster than command, and this realization shifted how he spoke, weaving vision carefully so others felt included rather than driven. Each challenge carried both threat and invitation, and he trained himself to see opportunity without becoming blinded by it, maintaining balance between daring imagination and grounded assessment. The landscape around him changed constantly, yet his inner compass steadied, built from accumulated listening, study, and restraint practice long before circumstance demanded proof. When uncertainty appeared publicly, he acknowledged it internally rather than denying its presence, understanding that honest awareness strengthened resolve more reliably than false certainty. He carried forward a quiet humor about human expectation, observing how quickly confidence followed success, and how fragile it became when questioned, a lesson never far from mind. Responsibility deepened empathy, since decisions affected unseen lives, and this awareness complicated ambition with care rather than diminishing its drive. He recognized moments when restraint earned greater loyalty than display because measured response signaled trust in time and preparation rather than impatience for applause. Fatigue arrived not only in body but thought, yet he learned to distinguish exhaustion from doubt, addressing each differently so neither quietly undermined resolve. The closer influence came, the more he valued counsel that challenged him, seeking friction that refined intention instead of agreement that merely comforted pride. He understood that momentum invited overreach, and he guarded against it through reflection, ensuring direction remained purposeful rather than reactive. Curiosity remained active, preventing rigidity, because adaptability felt essential in landscapes shaped by unpredictability and human complexity. Even admiration could isolate, so he practiced humility through attention, making space for voices that might otherwise withdraw under hierarchy's shadow. Every step forward reshaped identity, and he accepted this fluidity, knowing consistency of values mattered more than consistency of appearance. He saw how fear operated quietly in others, and this insight informed patience, allowing time for trust to build where force would fracture connection. Success magnified consequences, which sharpened ethical awareness, reminding him that greatness without care hollowed meaning rather than fulfilling it. He learned that narrative influenced morale, and he shaped stories responsibly, balancing inspiration with honesty to avoid fragile illusions. Moments of decisive clarity alternated with nights of contemplation, and this rhythm grounded him, preventing extremes from dominating judgment. As ambitions expanded, he revisited early questions, finding them matured rather than answered, and he welcomed their persistence as guideposts. He accepted that belonging might never arrive as comfort, but instead as commitment to shared direction formed through effort and mutual trust. Influence demanded transparency with oneself, and he practiced this inward accountability even when external praise attempted distraction. He noticed how quickly power distorted memory, so he preserved reminders of earlier uncertainty to maintain proportion and perspective. Movement across spaces deepened understanding of difference, reinforcing respect rather than conquest as foundation for sustainable authority. He balanced decisiveness with listening, recognizing that hesitation sometimes masked wisdom rather than weakness. With each resolved challenge, complexity increased, not simplified, which strengthened his capacity rather than overwhelming it. He grew comfortable with paradox, accepting softness alongside firmness, knowing both proved necessary depending on moment and context. Expectation never loosened, yet it transformed from pressure into dialogue, shaping motivation instead of suffocating it. He trusted preparation enough to act when moments demanded boldness, avoiding paralysis disguised as prudence. Reflection remained active even during motion, ensuring that action and intention evolved together rather than diverging. The inner world built through youth now met external reality, and their interaction refined purpose continuously. He resisted the temptation to rush conclusions, allowing experience to layer meaning gradually rather than forcing premature interpretation. Responsibility fostered maturity not through hardship alone, but through sustained awareness of consequence. He accepted that leadership exposed vulnerability, and he embraced it carefully as source of authenticity rather than liability. Ambition matured into direction, shaped less by impulse and more by considered alignment between means and meaning. He noticed how time compressed during intensity, and he learned to widen perspective deliberately to prevent narrow judgment. Relationships deepened through shared challenge, and he valued those bonds as stabilizing forces within constant motion. Victory no longer ended questions, but opened new ones, extending curiosity instead of closing chapters. He maintained internal dialogue, ensuring that action did not silence reflection, preserving balance between doing and becoming. As horizons widened, he sensed purpose clarifying not as destination, but as continuing process. He stood prepared at thresholds once imagined only inwardly, recognizing growth not as arrival, but readiness. The unfolding path invited commitment without final certainty, and he stepped forward willingly, guided by intention formed through careful, patient becoming.